you doing? Thank you for joining me once again for another thrilling episode of Who's Wrong on the Interwebs today. Today's willing contender is a recidivist defender. It's Paul Saladino again. And today he wants to tell us all about the Randle Cycle. Well, he wants to tell us selected things about the Randle Cycle. He wants to tell us information that suits him, or misinformation that suits him. He wants to give us a partial story. He wants to misrepresent the reality of the situation in order to suit his ideology and to subserve his view that the consumption of fruit is innocuous and not a problem, and to justify his addiction to carbohydrates thusly. So let's listen to what Paul has to say about the Randle Cycle, much of which is correct, and put him right where he's wrong, because some of it is very, very badly wrong, unfortunately, Paul. Okay, stick around. That's what's coming next. Well, it's coming now. Let's go.
Caitlin, she says, Paul, I've been hearing a lot about the Randle Cycle. I don't fully understand the biochemistry. Does the Randle Cycle mean that we shouldn't eat carbohydrates and fat together?
Yes, it does mean that, for reasons that we'll get to as the video progresses.
Is this going to make me fat if I do this?
Not necessarily, no. That's another step. That's a different argument. One of the potential outcomes of chronic Randle Cycle activation is indeed the gaining of adiposity, fatness, but it's not a fait accompli. It's not necessarily associated with chronic activation of the Randle Cycle. You have to take in effectively more energy across the day than you are expending in order to store a significant amount of fat, whether or not you have Randle Cycle activation, actually. So, notice I said energy there and not calories, because they're not the same thing. Okay, cool.
How should I navigate eating fruit on my animal-based diet? So
you shouldn't. That's how you should navigate eating fruit on an animal-based diet. You should not do it.
I think there's a lot of people in the dogmatic carnivore community.
The dogmatic carnivore community. So that's the way that you try to cast aspersions, and you try to have a crack at the credibility of others who might just happen to know more about something than you do, Paul, is to append some kind of ridiculous label like dogmatic to them. Instead of doing that, why don't you actually deal with the material at hand? In fact, probably the best way to deal with the material at hand, rather than espousing your opinion about the material, Paul, is to actually come in front of someone like myself who does know a lot about this, a great deal, and actually have a discussion with me live on camera about it. It will be educational for everybody. You keep saying you're open to such things, and you keep not fronting up for such a thing. So why don't you front up, Paul, and let's have a discussion about the Randle Cycle, for example. Okay?
Chirping about Randle Cycle, when I am talking about including fruit on my animal-based diet. But
yeah, because there's a problem with adding fruit on your diet, Paul, and well, there are a number of problems with fruit, one of which is Randle Cycle activation, which is absolutely, definitely, unequivocally problematic for a number of reasons, including the chronic systemic inflammation that will accrue as a result of chronically activated Randle Cycle, which will at some point cause you a health concern. And I would suggest, Paul, that the thing that is currently staving off a serious health problem for yourself associated with your fruity behavior is your very high level of physical activity. As soon as you stop doing that, Paul, you will find yourself in a world of trouble. There's no two ways about that. Okay? So, anyway, tell us all about the Randle Cycle.
If you really look at the biochemistry underlying the Randle Cycle...
Yes, I really have done, Paul, thanks.
This doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, actually. Evolution-wise, biologically, and in every sense, the Randle Cycle makes absolute perfect sense. What it does is it protects the internal workings, the cell membranes, the organelles, the internal workings, the DNA, etc., inside important cells like liver cells, muscle cells, etc. It protects those cells from the damage that they would experience if the concentration of glucose in those cells were higher than what it ought to be. Glycation is a very immediately problematic toxicity issue. It absolutely damages biological tissues without question. Glycation is a bad thing. The glycation, for example, of red blood cells is a measure of blood sugar control. For that very reason, it gives us an idea of how damaged those red blood cells have become. What the Randle cycle does is when the level of sugar in the blood is elevated above the resting homeostatic set point, it locks the doors on the cells to the influx of still further glucose. It controls the concentration of glucose in the cells. As such, the red blood cells and the vascular epithelial cells become the sacrificial lambs to speak of, which is fine because those cells, well, it's fine evolution-wise, in the way that we lived as we evolved for 350,000 years at least, because the red blood cells and the epithelial cells are replaced on a much shorter time scale than other cells can be replaced. So if they are the cells that bear the brunt of the assault of what was, as we evolved, very, very rare spikes in our blood sugar, that's fine. The problem nowadays, Paul, is that we are, not all of us, some of us, you, Paul, among others, are subjecting your body to vast, vast spikes in your glucose in comparison to what you are evolution-wise designed for. Your whole body is designed in order to keep your blood glucose at a certain level and stable around that level and not to spike upwards or drop below that. And every single time you pour a large amount of carbohydrate material down your neck, you are absolutely cause and effect causing a spike in your glucose to occur. That is always a bad thing. I've heard you try to argue otherwise recently. It's absolute nonsense. You should never spike your blood sugar in the way that you're doing. It is absolutely demonstrably, shockingly bad for you. One of the ramifications of it is that the Randle cycle is activated every time you do it, and it will lock the doors of the cells to the influx of glucose. One of the side ramifications of that is an inflammatory response. Okay? Facts. Anyway, carry on.
So let's just start with what the Randle cycle is. It's essentially substrate level competition that...
It's not a competition. It's a cross inhibition. It's an absolute piece of machinery, really, a piece of metabolic machinery that is a sliding scale mechanism in every given individual cell. It's not either on or off. It's a sliding scale between fully activated and fully deactivated in every individual cell and every organ at large, and therefore across your body at large. Some areas of your body might be experiencing Randle cycle activation while others are not, for example. It's very, very complex. But anyway, carry on.
Prefers to use the fuel that is already being used.
No, it's got nothing to do with what is already being used, Paul. Nothing whatsoever. It has to do with what is available outside the cell, knocking on the door trying to get in, and ergo it's also to do with what is in the cell cytosol. Simple as that. It's nothing to do with what is being used. It's to do with what is there ready to be used. Okay?
In human biochemistry.
So completely wrong, Paul. Completely wrong there.
This means that when you are doing glucose metabolism, which most of us are doing if we are eating any carbohydrates at a meal.
In fact, Paul, everybody, and that means everybody, is undertaking glucose metabolism at all times. All of us. By the very virtue of sitting upright in this chair, I have a number of muscles which are twitching and being active to maintain my upright posture so I don't fall in a pile on the floor. All muscle contractions in all muscle fibers at all intensities of exercise, from complete rest right up to volitional exhaustion, all of those are subserved by glucose, Paul. So to suggest that you have to be eating glucose to be undertaking glucose metabolism is wrong. It's false. False again. What's next?
The breakdown products of the Krebs cycle, including malonyl-CoA from glucose metabolism.
That's not a breakdown product. It's an intermediary.
Inhibit carnitine palmitoyl transferase.
Yes.
This is part of the system that shuttles fatty acids toward beta oxidation in the mitochondria.
Yes.
Similarly, and conversely, high concentrations of acetyl-CoA and citrate from beta oxidation, which is fatty acid oxidation, inhibit the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex.
Yes.
That shuttles glucose metabolites toward the Krebs cycle in our biochemistry.
Yes.
This is the preference for using the fuel that is already in use.
No, you said that before. It was wrong the first time, and it's wrong the second time as well, Paul. No, it's nothing to do with what is in use. It's to do with what is there available for use.
So what are we talking about here? We're basically talking about the fact that if you are metabolizing glucose,
which everybody does at all times,
then you're not going to be in ketosis and doing beta oxidation.
False. Again, Paul, false again. You absolutely can be in ketosis and oxidize glucose because everybody is oxidizing glucose at all times. Sorry about that. Facts again.
These are not mutually exclusive. And you can do beta oxidation. You can use fatty acids when you are not necessarily in ketosis. But
yes,
if you listen to the podcast I did with Thomas DeLauer, you know that.
Why would we do that, Paul?
When you are in ketosis, when you are using beta oxidation, when you are shuttling.
Well, hang on, which? Because ketosis and beta oxidation are not the same thing, Paul. They are different aspects of metabolism happening at quite different areas of the metabolism and also of the body itself. So which are you talking about here, and what is the ramification of it?
Fatty acids, non-esterified fatty acids, which are in your blood.
Everybody is using non-esterified fatty acids at all times, Paul. It's not a choice to use glucose or fat. All cells, apart from the brain, really, are going to use fatty acids and glucose at some mixture at all times.
Through the mitochondria, through carnitine palmitoyl transferase, through beta oxidation, you are in ketosis a lot of the time. And that process is going to create physiologic insulin resistance at the level of the muscle.
No. Wrong. Completely false. Ketosis does not cause insulin resistance. Not at all. Why would it? Beta oxidation of non-esterified fatty acids does not cause insulin resistance. Why would it? What it does cause is an acute, an immediate, relatively immediate, downregulation of the ability of the cells to import glucose and to oxidize glucose if there is an overplus of free fatty acids, which is absolutely indicated and absolutely fine and not remotely in any way pathological. It's part of the normal functioning of the metabolic system. It's part of your homeostatic mechanism.
So you're refusing glucose. So basically, if you're in ketosis, if you don't have carbohydrates, your body is going to spare.
If you don't have carbohydrates, Paul, you die. Because your brain wants to run on glucose. Can't run on fats. You can't get fats across the blood-brain barrier. You can't make enough ketones to subserve brain function. In deepest nutritional ketosis, you're going to struggle to get more than about 18, 19% of the energy entering your brain in the form of ketones. If your blood sugar drops below the minimum level to subserve brain function, you will die, Paul. So please get a clue of what you are talking about, or learn how to communicate more carefully, more rationally, and more accurately about phenomena, because what you're saying here is just wrong.
Glucose for the tissues that really need it, the brain, the testicles, the adrenals. And if you have glucose in the environment, as I've said on previous podcasts, this is really a signal of abundance for humans, and the body.
No, it's a signal that there is a lot of glucose in the blood. And that's the only thing it's a signal of, Paul.
Is not going to burn fatty acids in the.
Humans don't burn anything, Paul. The series of reactions that occur in the human body which create ATP for metabolic process is not burning. Okay?
Sense of it's not going to make non-esterified fatty acids from the fat tissue. It's not going to increase non-esterified fatty acids in the blood. It's not going to.
Well, what a shock. If your blood and ergo the cell fluids of your cells are awash with glucose, then your body is going to use that glucose first to get it out of the way because of its known toxic effects on the body. So it's going to oxidize that down to carbon dioxide plus water so that that level of toxic load in the body is reduced. And of course, the beta oxidation and the delivery of acetyl units to the Krebs cycle via that side of the pathway will be downregulated as a result of that. Again, it's just homeostasis. It's just the body protecting itself. Of course. Goodness me. What's next?
To create physiologic peripheral insulin resistance in that state of ketosis.
Again, with this insulin resistance idea. No. What piece of kit measures insulin resistance, Paul? What metric is put on insulin resistance? It is a concept. It's a construct. It's an idea. You can measure blood glucose in millimoles per litre. You can measure free fatty acids in millimoles per litre. You can measure adrenaline. You can measure insulin. You can measure all sorts of things as an actual measurement. What measurement do you put on insulin resistance? How many millimoles per litre of insulin resistance is a body experiencing at any given time? Can't be done because it's not a physical substance. It's not a physiological, biological signal. It's an idea. It's a proxy measure put together on the basis of a bunch of other things. It is also fundamentally a false idea. When insulin is not effective in getting the cells to respond to insulin, it is because the Randle cycle is activated highly at that time. A situation which is rapidly ameliorable by, stopping with the carbohydrates. Simple. Within about half an hour, 45 minutes, in a very sluggish individual, you can get them right back to where they ought to be in terms of responding appropriately to a bolus of insulin and carbohydrate. If you do the right things in that half an hour, 45 minutes to get that situation under control. It might take a bit longer than that in some individuals who have vastly, hugely, grossly elevated blood glucose. An uncontrolled diabetic, for example, would be tougher to get them back within half an hour, 45 minutes. But for most people, we can do it if you know how.
Ketosis because it can use glucose. Now, your body goes back and forth with these throughout the day.
Yes. So in the post-absorptive state, you have a store of energy substrates in your blood that the cells can draw down and use as they need to, at whatever rate they are metabolizing and at whatever rate they are living, doing their thing based on your genetics, your age, your gender, your activity levels, the time of year that it is, all those kind of things. Yes. And it does, and it uses a mixture of fats and carbohydrates, absolutely. No problem. Anytime there is vastly more energy in the blood than is needed at that time by the cells of the body, if the energy stores in that blood are significantly even, if there is a mixture of carbs and fats there, then the Randle cycle will be activated. In other words, every single time you eat a meal which is mixed macronutrient in terms of fats and carbohydrates, in the post-absorptive state, once you have absorbed that food, for at least a goodly number of hours after that meal, you will absolutely experience Randle cycle activation, until such time as the level of substrates in your blood drops below a level that significantly activates the Randle cycle in you. There are set points, there is a hysteresis on that. It is part of an integrated system of the body as a whole, yes, and you need to understand that. What is your point here, Paul?
To differing degrees. We must be doing some level of beta oxidation throughout the day. It's not an on or off switch.
Neither is the Randle cycle, Paul.
But these processes are in competition to some degree, which is normal human
It's not competition, it's cross-inhibition. That's not the same thing.
Biochemistry. I think most of the time, you don't want to be in ketosis. You want your muscles to be insulin sensitive.
Being in ketosis does not mean that you are not insulin sensitive. If anything, Paul, being in ketosis will lead you to a higher likelihood of being more insulin sensitive. Because if you are in ketosis, it means your blood sugar level is near baseline, and as such, the Randle cycle will be entirely deactivated and your sensitivity to insulin will be at its highest at that time. Goodness sake.
You want the glucose disposal? You want the glucose disposal.
That's right, you want glucose disposed of because it is toxic. Or you could short-circuit that whole process, Paul, by not pouring that inappropriate and unnecessary toxin into your body in the first place. Then there'd be no rush to clear it, would there? Jobs are good and what's next?
Disposal to be happening at the level of your muscles. As you know, if you've listened to my podcast on ketosis, why I'm not a fan, the recent one with Thomas.
We know why you're not a fan, Paul. You're not a fan because to be in a largely ketogenic lifestyle, you need to control your carbohydrate intake vastly more than you are. You need to deal with a carbohydrate addiction, which you clearly and patently have one of, Paul. And you need to stop doing that to yourself. You need to take responsibility for your own health long term, which you're not doing at the moment, Paul. And you need to take responsibility for your misanthropic malpractice of telling others that it's perfectly okay to poison themselves. Okay? Because it's not okay, Paul.
Lower. When you are in ketosis, your fasting blood sugar will be higher.
No, not necessarily. That's one of the things that can happen if you remain in a ketotic state for a period of time which is longer than what is indicated. Basically, the design is that you are supposed to cycle out of ketosis for several hours postprandially, and the way that occurs, Paul, is by consuming one decent bolus of protein in a day, sufficient to cause some gluconeogenic response, thus to, for want of a better term, kick you out of ketosis for several hours. Okay? Then your blood sugar will be perfect. So again, with the half-truths and the half-information and the ideology, which is all designed to do nothing more than to provide an apparent rationale for your self-abuse and your dangerous contraindicated misanthropic advice to others. Paul, it's unacceptable. Stop it.
Because you are physiologically insulin resistant.
No, that's a construct. That's a concept. What piece of kit measures it? What are the units of measurement on insulin resistance, Paul? Let's have a debate about that while we talk about the Randle cycle as well, Paul, shall we? Be a very interesting chat.
Your non-esterified fatty acids in the blood will be higher. If you listen to my blood work podcast.
Not necessarily, Paul. Again, it depends on many, many factors, including age, stage, time of year, time of day, activity levels, all sorts of things come into play there. You're just making wild, generalized statements that may or may not be correct on a case-by-case basis. It's ridiculous, Paul.
Podcast, you know that my non-esterified fatty acids are very low right now.
Right now, this minute. How do you know, Paul? Have you tested it right this minute? No, because you're making a video for us right now. You have no idea right now what your non-esterified fatty acids are. And even if they are quite low right now, so? Have you been out surfing this morning? In which case, all of your blood-borne stored energy resources will be depleted until you consume some more food. That's how it works. What's your point?
0.12 because I am including carbohydrates in my diet.
No. You just made a cause and effect statement there, Paul, which you cannot support with evidence. It's just your ideology. An ideology which, frankly, Paul, leads you inexorably to a situation where you are going absolutely to spend a significant amount of time with the Randle cycle activated, and it's clear and patent after any reasonable period of time of doing that, those kind of things will be written all over somebody that is suffering that. I'm not allowed to mention anybody's appearance on the YouTubes, Paul. But people have eyes. Okay, what's next?
When I was on a ketogenic diet, my non-esterified fatty acids were much higher, 0.6. This is physiologic insulin resistance.
No, it isn't, Paul. That is a construct. That is an idea. That is your philosophy. That is your interpretation. It's not a fact. It is a misinterpretation of the physiological facts at hand.
This is essentially what the Randle cycle is talking about. But I think this gets...
The Randle cycle isn't talking about anything. The Randle cycle is a homeostatic mechanism that is designed purely by, well, at least 4.5 million years of evolution to protect your cells from an overplus of sugar.
It's conflated and misunderstood a lot in these, dare I say, dogmatic ketogenic...
You dare say it, yes, Paul, twice, in fact, in this video, and it was stupid and ignorant on your part the first occasion you said that, and it's just as stupid and ignorant now. Okay? Making a label of calling someone dogmatic does not affect the veracity of anything they have to say.
Dogmatic carnivore communities to say that you will get fat if you eat fruit and animal fat together.
That's a straw man. There might be some people running around saying you will get fat if you eat fruits and meat together. I'm not saying that. It's more likely that you will, especially if your activity level is a lot lower than what Paul's is, like most people's. But it's not a fait accompli, as I've said. It's a straw man. That's ridiculous. The problem with the Randle cycle, Paul, is chronic systemic inflammation and all the sequelae involved with that. Okay?
And I am living proof of that as I am ballooning and getting super fat. This is
no, in actual fact, if anything, Paul, once again, I'm not mentioning your appearance because that's bullying, apparently, and harassment, according to the new limp, woke, lefty side of the universe at the moment. If anything, there is a loss of condition over the last couple of years that's quite patent. There's a loss of apparent youth. There's there are clear signs of quite serious issues at a cellular level.
It's obviously a joke. So what we can see very clearly from thousands of people who are eating an animal-based diet, we hope that thousands more will join us for Animal-Based 30 at Heart and Soil, that when you eat an animal-based diet, a lot of people lose.
You seriously need to sit on your hands, Paul, when you present. It's really, really distracting. It doesn't add to your message. It detracts from your message. It makes it very, very difficult to pay attention to what you are even saying.
Weight. Most people are going to lose weight. They're going to become more jacked. They're going to become more lean. So clearly eating fruit and animal fat together doesn't make you fat. That's not what the Randle Cycle.
That, again, just ridiculous straw man. However, if you are Joe Public with a Joe Public level of physical activity on a weekly basis, having the Randle cycle activated for a significant amount of every single day will absolutely lead you to a higher likelihood of fat storage. Yes, it will.
Cycle is really saying, it's not saying.
I mean, Paul, if you just stop with all the physical activity that you're currently undertaking and continue with the exact same diet, the problem will become clear very, very quickly.
That if I eat a steak with some fat along with fruit, that fat is going to get stuck on my body and I'm going to become fat.
Again, it's just the same straw man. You're just repeating yourself, Paul.
Yes, my body may preference burning the glucose.
Your body doesn't burn anything, Paul. I've covered that.
During that meal, but later on, overnight, I'm easily going to go into a fat burning mode. I'm easily going to moderate my fat.
Okay, so stop with all the physical activity during the day. As I said, keep eating the same way and we'll see what happens.
Stores because I am an insulin sensitive, metabolically healthy individual.
Well, both of those are constructs, concepts, and I would take issue with both of those, Paul. I've already taken very, very clear issue with the construct, the concept of insulin sensitivity or resistance, and I would suggest that you are anything but metabolically healthy, Paul. As I say, clear signposts, clear signposts. Okay.
I think that many people who are thinking about this and worried about the Randle cycle in terms of the actual eating of carbohydrates and fat together haven't read probably the original paper by.
Yes, I have, very, very carefully, of course, Paul. In fact, it was me that brought it to the attention of the community here at large, it having been kind of buried in a pile of papers over the last however many years. It was done in 1962 or 63 from memory, and it never really garnered the attention it should. It never really captured the attention, I guess, of physiologists at the time, precisely because it flew in the face of the ideology that held sway at the time. Not because it was incorrect in any way in terms of here are the enzymes, here is the system, here is what we are saying, the metabolic system, here is how it works, here is how it functionally behaves. Of course, what you will see in the paper written by Randle and others in the early 60s is language which is clearly informed, clearly influenced by the ideas that held sway at the time. And as such, a lot of the verbiage in that paper is actually misinformative. The informative part of the paper, the thing that it is correct and unquestioned, is what the Randle cycle is and how it functionally works at the level of all the different enzymes and things. It still needs to be interpreted correctly, and not even Randle and colleagues were able to do so at the time. Probably, as I say, because of the ideas that held sway at that time, more than anything else. Anyway, show us that, Paul, and I'll point to it.
PJ Randle, which I'll show here on the screen. The title is The Glucose Fatty Acid Cycle, Its Role in Insulin Sensitivity.
Yes, a construct, a concept. What they were really proposing is here is an actual mechanism by which the insulin sensitivity, the acute insulin sensitivity, can be adjusted upward and downward at the cellular end of proceedings by either locking the doors to the cell or by throwing those doors open, or anywhere in between. What's your point, Paul?
and the metabolic disturbances of diabetes mellitus. And if you read this, he says...
Yes, so these people were researching into diabetes, and one of the things that is proposed to be associated with diabetes is a problem with insulin sensitivity, a construct. Sure, if you like, most of the time, almost all of the time that there is an issue with insulin sensitivity, what you actually have is a chronically activated Randle cycle, and the way to ameliorate is to deactivate the thing. Okay, fine.
We now wish to summarize evidence which appears to show that the high plasma concentrations of NEFA, which are non-esterified fatty acids, in parentheses, or the underlying breakdown of glycerides, of which it is a symptom, stands in a causal relationship to these abnormalities of carbohydrate metabolism.
Yes, right. So the verbiage there that's problematic is carbohydrate abnormalities or abnormalities of carbohydrate metabolism. It's not abnormal for the physiological functioning of the system to do exactly what it should do. The Randle cycle is not a physiologic abnormality, nor is it a pathology. It is the system functioning precisely as it should. And that is to say, when there is a sufficiency of energy in the form of fatty acids around, inside the cell cytosol, and as such, there would be a pooling of glucose, should glucose be allowed to enter that cell. And given the toxicity of the pooling of glucose, that cell locks the doors and says, no, thank you. We will protect the cell at the cost of the sacrificial lamb, of the red blood cells and the epithelial cells of the vascular tree. Not an abnormality, not a pathology, not a problem, not the cause of diabetes at all, but a symptom of it. The disease diabetes is elevated blood glucose, Paul, and nothing else. That is what the pathology is, that is how it is diagnosed, and that is what needs to be treated. The elevation of blood glucose. Okay? You really haven't made any inroads into making any justification for pouring unnecessary toxic carbohydrates down your neck ever, Paul, let alone multiple times a day in hundreds and hundreds of grams amounts, Paul. Okay? At all.
The abnormalities of carbohydrate metabolism being the things I mentioned earlier, that these products of beta oxidation, specifically citrate and acetyl-CoA, do serve to...
Yeah, citrate and acetyl coenzyme A are not only products of beta oxidation, Paul, they are also both products of pyruvate dehydrogenase complex activity. You haven't even got that delineated correctly in your mind. Wow.
To inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase. And they go on to say, and we suggest that this is a distinct biochemical syndrome, which could appropriately be called the fatty acid syndrome. We wish to propose...
And you could argue that that would be appropriate to label it thusly. I would argue the antithetical view on that. Randle and colleagues here have used some very, very poor wording precisely to be soothing to those in the fraternity of nutrition science at that time, and still, to be fair, that belief structure would be remotely justifiable. To point the finger of blame, if you like, at fats for what is a pathological situation with regard to sugar is fundamentally false and ridiculous. That part is completely wrong. They have misinterpreted the very thing they themselves have discovered in this paper. That happens.
Propose further that there are interactions between glucose and fatty acid metabolism in muscle and adipose tissue, which take the form of a cycle, the glucose fatty acid cycle, and which are fundamental to the control of glucose and fatty acid concentrations in the blood.
Yes.
And of insulin sensitivity.
Concept. acute insulin sensitivity at that exact moment on the basis of what is available in the blood at that time. Yes.
You can see here that they detail this glucose fatty acid cycle.
Not really. That's a schema, and it's very, very undetailed. In fact, there are a lot of granular details missing from that little chart there.
Including fatty acid acyl-CoA, glucose going to L-glycerol 3-phosphate, triglycerides, glycerol, and fatty acids. But the take-home message in this paper and in the actual understanding of this human biochemistry.
No, an interpretation by its authors, which is completely inappropriate and false in many ways. The take-home message of the paper is, here is the Randle cycle, here are the enzymes involved, here are the points of blockade, here is how the cross-inhibition works. All correct. The interpretation, their interpretation of it, not quite right.
Is that the products of human fatty acid metabolism are going to favor the continuation of fatty acid metabolism.
And the same is true of glucose, Paul. They cross-inhibit one another, however.
Well, that sounds great. We should all be in ketosis all the time. We'll burn all of our fat.
No. No, that's a bad idea. That has bad effects on your thyroid function. It has bad effects on your ability to maintain your electrolyte balances as they should be maintained, Paul. Okay? And, all you need to do is to cycle out of ketosis once a day. And the way to do that is to eat once a day and to eat a bolus of protein sufficient to cause that to occur. You still don't need a single gram of carbohydrate, not 1 gram ever. Sorry about that, Paul.
Except we won't, and we'll get electrolyte problems, testosterone issues, all the things I've talked about in the past. There's a balance here. It is okay to eat carbohydrates from fruit with your fat.
No, it isn't, Paul. False. Randle cycle, chronic systemic inflammation, sequelae involved with that. Not to mention the deuterium issue, okay? So no, Paul, it is not okay to eat sugar ever. Under any circumstances. There is no excuse for eating sugar. There is no justification for eating sugar. And your dangerous, contraindicated malpractice and misinformation here is a great disservice to mankind. Stop it.
This doesn't mean that you will get fat.
So what? That's not the issue here. That's your straw man. It's pathetic, Paul.
I'm clearly not a fat individual. I'm very lean, if you've seen it.
You're also clearly not an individual who understands where his expertise lies and where it does not, Paul. You're clearly also not a man who understands when he should stop. Okay, you are a psychiatrist. Go and do psychiatry.
Any of my Instagram or other social media where I frequently have my shirt off because I'm often surfing or just in Costa Rica because I'm...
Sit on your hands, Paul.
In a warm place, but...
Or at least keep them still.
This isn't the way it ends up being in human biochemistry. This is a misunderstanding of the Randle...
The only misunderstanding here, Paul, is the one that you are promulgating here. Okay? Yet more dangerous disinformation from Paul Saladino. It's disgraceful. What's next?
Cycle. The Randle cycle is talking about the reasons.
It is not talking about anything. It just is. It has a function and it does it perfectly.
We become physiologically insulin resistant.
Nonsense.
When you avoid carbohydrate.
Nonsense. The exact opposite occurs, in fact, most likely.
And the fact that when you add back carbohydrates, that process will then damp down fatty acid metabolism. That's normal human biochemistry. We favor glucose in our metabolism. That's fine.
No, we don't favor glucose in our metabolism. We get rid of it first precisely because of its toxicity. For goodness sake. Wrong again, Paul.
You won't get fat. So hopefully that's an...
You will get fat, actually, most likely, Paul, if you are not highly, highly active and you also activate the Randle cycle on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day. You absolutely are more likely to get fat if you do that. Good luck being able to have as much time to go surfing and do weight training and be as active as Paul Saladino is. Good luck to you. If you want to take advice from this man, go ahead. It's your funeral, boys and girls.
explanation of you guys of the Randle Cycle, why I don't fear it. I think this has been widely...
You don't respect it, Paul. It's not anything to do with fear. You don't respect the Randle Cycle and its ramifications, precisely, son, because you don't understand it. You have no idea what you're talking about at all. You have a bit of knowledge, and a bit of knowledge is more dangerous than none at all, actually, Paul. You are completely out of your depth. You do not understand what you're talking about, and you are leading other folks up the garden path in a totally inappropriate manner, and you need to stop doing it.
Misunderstood, widely misinterpreted, and all of the chirping in the community just needs to stop because...
No, what needs to stop, Paul, is you. You need to stop. You are out of line, you are out of your lane, and you are promulgating disinformation. You are telling people that it is perfectly okay to pour sugar down their necks. There is no way out of that, Paul. There is no excuse for that behaviour, none at all. Never will be, never has been. You are the one in the wrong here, Paul. Absolutely and without question. You are the one that needs to stop. Am I clear? The door is open. Come and debate me on this, sunshine, and I will tear you 7 new orifices because you do not have the background here. You do not have the understanding. You do not know what you're talking about. Simple. Right, the rest of you, you know the drill. Don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. Join me next time when someone else will be wrong on the interwebs, but not as wrong as Paul, because that's a whole different level of wrongness. Again, it's the highest order of wrongness. Okay, see you then.